This is a video where I would like to cover just a little bit about the procedures that were followed in People versus Strong. I think it'll be useful for your understanding of the case. So basically, it requires an explanation about what happens in New York State in a criminal trial. After the proof has been closed, the trial judge brings the defense attorney and the prosecutor together for a conference, and this is going to happen before the attorneys deliver their summations, and the judge charges the jury before the jury deliberates. And at that conference, the judge is going to ask the attorneys whether they want the judge to charge down. And what that means is to give the jury the option of finding the defendant not guilty of the crime that he's or her has been charged with, but a lesser offense, as opposed to just guilty or not guilty on the charged crime. Oftentimes, defense attorneys like this charge down approach because it's a way to cut losses. In People versus Strong, I think, is a great example. What happens in People versus Strong, the defendant is charged with reckless homicide. If you're his defense attorney, you've got to know that there's no way that a jury is going to find this guy not guilty. It's just not going to happen. What he did was outrageous. What you could do for him, it seems to me, though, is convince a jury that the government didn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was reckless, and that really the proper verdict would be finding him guilty only of criminally negligent homicide. Now, I don't know if the defendant would appreciate that strategy, but what it does is it cuts a 15-year potential sentence down to a 4-year potential sentence. And to me, that's a real service to a defendant who isn't going to walk out of that courtroom with a not guilty verdict. Now, when the request is made to the trial judge to charge down, the trial judge must grant that request if any reasonable view of the evidence would support the conclusion that a jury might find the defendant not guilty of the charged crime, but guilty of the lesser crime. In People versus Strong, the defense attorney, as I have been suggesting, asked for a charge down to criminally negligent homicide, which would mean then that the judge would say to the jury, you have a choice. You can, and then go through all of the elements of the crime. And if you don't find that the government has met its burden of establishing beyond a reasonable doubt all the elements of the crime of reckless homicide, then you can consider whether or not there's sufficient proof to find the defendant guilty of criminally negligent homicide. When that request was made, the trial judge denied it. The trial judge said there's no way that a reasonable view of the evidence would support the conclusion that the defendant was unaware of the risk, because the trial judge reasoned no reasonable person would ever be unaware of the risk of death caused by putting a knife into someone's chest and a hatchet into their hip. So the jury only had the one choice, the choice being was the defendant guilty of reckless homicide or not. Not surprisingly, the jury found the defendant guilty. So an appeal was taken to the Intermediate Appellate Court, Appellate Division, in this case 4th Department, because we were in Rochester. The 4th Department, and there was some dissenters, but they affirmed the conviction, and the case went to the Court of Appeals. It was too good of a case for the Court of Appeals not to take a look at it, seems to me. In any event, you have the Court of Appeals decision, and the Court of Appeals said that the trial judge was wrong in that he committed a legal error. He should have charged the jury, or should have given the jury the charge down so the jury would have had a choice of reckless homicide or criminally negligent homicide. And what you'll see in the Court of Appeals decision is that the Court of Appeals said that when it gets to risk perception, it's what did this defendant perceive or not perceive, and a reasonable jury could conclude that this guy really was not aware of the risk. And I think that's a fair statement. That's not a conclusion that the Court of Appeals reached, but if you believe the evidence in the defendant, and I don't think there was any expert testimony, but today I would consider expert testimony of the double down theory, and I suspect there's expert testimony possibly available about how people who are not mentally ill, but who nevertheless can become intoxicated by their own ego. Let that sink in for a bit. So what happens is the Court of Appeals reverses the conviction. Now, what that really means in this case isn't that Strong was set free, but it meant that he was entitled to a new trial, and at that new trial, presuming the evidence was essentially the same, the jury would have been given that choice to charge down. Which may now cause you to ask this question, well, what happened next? The case then goes off the radar screen in terms of legal research. I had a student back in the 1980s, I think, who was working for the Division of Parole for the state. She suggested, and she did it very cryptically, so I don't know what she looked at or didn't look at, but she suggested that what might have happened is that the case was sent down and then Strong copped a plea with a sentencing commitment. And I'm making this up, but for example, if he got a sentence of whatever, 10 years, and he'd already done 3 years, that if he did another year or two, he would be out. I suspect something like that happened. But at least knowing what the charge down deal is and knowing why the appeal was taken because the charge down wasn't given, you'll understand how the Court of Appeals reaches the case. Again, the takeaway on the substantive law is this. When we consider whether there's gross negligence, if we're looking at criminally negligent or recklessly, we use the objective standard of the reasonable person and ask, was there an extreme deviation from the standard of care? If we then get to risk perception, and we will if we conclude there's gross negligence or extreme negligence, now we look not at the reasonable person, but did this defendant perceive the risk, or did this defendant not perceive the risk? And the trial judge was wrong in his analysis that it was the reasonable person standard that governed the perception standard. And when you get to that point, it's a subjective standard of what did this defendant know or not know. Okay, I hope this helps with an understanding of People versus Strong.